This is Gene, and I'm here with Ryan Capps. Say hi,
Hey
Ryan.
guys.
And we're going to start a new series, Ninth Age Theory, and this is going to be driven primarily by Ryan. So I'm going to kind of let him take over.
Yeah, so this kind of all started actually last year. I was captain of USA, for anyone who doesn't know me, and our coach Hugo kind of brought up. We had gotten a couple sessions in of like our weekly Skype calls and stuff, and Hugo said, "Is this what you guys typically do?" And we said, yeah, we've been talking about, what lists are good and gone through some European tournaments and stuff like that. And he was like, I think there's really a better way to do this. I think, you could spend more time trying to improve your play. And we said, well, how do you improve your play other than just playing more games? And that started kind of our adventure down what we later termed the path of macro Warhammer. So that's kind of what we ended up talking to Gene about, and what we're going to try to bring to people. It's a what we're hoping to do, I think, is bring some videos that focus not just on what Hugo would call the micro aspects of Warhammer, which are, this unit beats this one, or this magic item combo is really cool. But it's kind of taking a step back and looking at theories and tactics and kind of an overall approach to the game where you can maximize your play, and try to take your game to another level. Because I think a lot of times people get focused on the nitty gritty, but they don't see the broader picture of what's happening in the game, and that's sometimes why they lose. I think a lot of times the reason that good players consistently do well, whether with different armies and different editions, is because some people, I think, have understood and kind of, either naturally or through work, understand some of these concepts, whereas other people, I think, haven't fully grasped them yet. So I just wanted to say thank you to Hugo. He was our coach last year. And he was the one who really kind of introduced us to this concept of kind of looking at Warhammer from a broader picture, and kind of looking at strategy from a step back. I also want to thank Abrasis, or Conrad. He's one of the Polish players. He has a great series of videos on his website, or his YouTube channel, which is called Abrasis. And he, I think, has been teaching people this for a while, just maybe not in these terms. I will tell you, I learned a lot from him. There are probably some things that I'm just going to directly steal from his channel, that he talked about, and just great things to include. But if you're looking for more content, go over and check his stuff out. It's awesome. Lastly, I'd like to thank Furion, who actually was one of the first people back in 8th edition, who was one of the first people I noticed talking about these concepts. And he had a lot of videos that were talking about, you shouldn't let dice matter. It's your play and your theory. And he would go through some of his videos and just show the first, 2 and 3 turns of a game. And initially I thought it was crazy. You can't know how a game's going to go after 2 turns. But the more we've kind of looked at it, you can get a lot from the game just by looking at deployment, and a couple turns in a movement. You can often predict what's going to happen. So that out of the way, we'll get into this. All right. So the goals here are overall to help people improve their play, and we're just going to focus on gameplay from the ground up. So a lot of this may initially seem very basic. I hope to kind of start with kind of a more broad perspective and then build up from that. And a lot of people may notice that a lot of what we're talking about seems like things that you are doing already. And it's because a lot of players pick up on this stuff innately, but I think there's a value in talking about it and kind of formalizing it. And so we really are going to try to focus on some of the basics here, and hopefully people find it helpful. Oh, and then I apologize. I've been sick all week, so I may cough through this channel. So I apologize to everyone for my hacking cough. So first up, just a couple kind of philosophy things that I just really want to focus on, and we tried to emphasize through Team USA the last year, but I think are really important to try to get ingrained in when you're trying to improve your play. It's the and this is something that Furion harped on all the time in his videos, is you put yourselves in a position to let luck matter. It is a dice game, and there are times where there are weird dice spikes that cause things to happen that shouldn't have, but you can affect those odds by your play. So even if you can just shift things 5% in your favor, that means that you're going to be winning more often than your opponent, and those things can stack up. It's the same, it's making them take a whole bunch of rerolled 10 checks on their leadership. Eventually they're going to fail one, or making sure that you're not taking those checks. It's little things like that if you can control it, you can prevent the dice from making a difference in your game. So the goal is, not to come away from the game and just be blaming everything that happened on dice. It does happen. There are weird dice spikes, but there are things you can control, and you should be focusing on that. The other thing. Sorry, closing the door here to minimize some of the sound in the background. My dog is rampaging around the house. Once again, kind of dice will happen, but you're trying to minimize your risk and maximize your opponent's risk. And that's how you're, especially once you've got the basics of the game down, going to really kind of see the game swing in your favor.
All right.
So this episode is going to be some basic stuff, just kind of on how do we win a game, some philosophy, some strategy, and just some overall kind of a general view on what we need to be doing to win a game. So there are a number of things you can do, and we're not going to go through all of this stuff right now, but I hope in future videos we may break down each of these things kind of individually in a lot more detail. But you can do some things pre-game that'll make a big difference. So, what we're going to be talking about today and probably in some future videos is theory, kind of how do you structure your list and how do you structure your army design and how to think about the game in a way that you can put yourself in a winning position. There's also, obviously, I think something that people focus on a lot, especially at lower levels, is, making sure those lists are really good. But obviously you want a list that synergizes with the theory. You can always practice more. That's something we're not going to be able to touch on in the channel, but obviously, that's how you're going to get better too. Then in game, there are a lot of things you can do. So stellar play really comes down to a couple other things. So deployment is a big thing, and we're going to hopefully in the future talk about reading maps and picking deployment zones and some tricks you can do in your deployment to kind of maximize your effectiveness. Movement. Honestly, this is probably the biggest thing in the game. The movement phase is how you win the game. So we want to talk about, how and why we're moving things in certain places, what units, how to get the most out of our units' movement. You obviously want to focus on objectives in the game. Picking up those objectives is huge. And then we'll probably talk about some what we termed micro play, which are the kind of the little nifty tricks and stuff you can do during a game that will put you in an advantageous position, but that's probably later down. Today we're going to focus more on kind of that first point, just some general theory.
Okay. All right. So starting with that.
We're going to talk about 4 different things. So one is kind of thinking macro. It's kind of macro is the term we're using kind of as the game as a whole, kind of general strategy, general tactics that we're going to focus on. We're going to talk about board control. And controlling the table. We're going to talk about dictating the combats that are favorable for you, and we're going to talk about objectives. So again, kind of something that we already talked about, but there are two different ways to view the game. There's the macro view of the game, just having a general strategy when you're entering the game, what you need to do. I need to avoid his Death Star and clear up the flanks, and I can jump on him the last turn if I'm not beat up too bad, or I need to keep his chaff out of the game so I can get the charges I want. And that also kind of involves seeing the board, as a whole, and kind of not getting isolated in just a couple little combats, but thinking about kind of the whole game and the whole, what's going to happen in a couple turns. Then, there's the micro view of the game, which is, once you have the strategy, once you've come up with how you think you can best win the game, you're going to focus on kind of how you practically execute that. What units win versus others, and some of the tricks you can do to, again, minimize losses and maximize gains.
Okay.
And so we want to. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm just kind of laughing at
that. So when we're talking about macro stuff, a lot of times, and one of the things that we noticed as we started doing this as a team, that it does help to try to develop a little bit of a language, so you can more accurately describe the things that are happening on the table. Otherwise, it gets down too much to this unit does this and this unit does this, and it's harder to visualize the whole game. If you can develop a common language, it's more easy to kind of talk about the theory and what's happening on a larger perspective. So some terms that we came up with that we'll probably be using in future videos, I just want to share with people. So first off, zone of control. So that is, you can see in the picture, it is the threat zone that your unit puts out. It is the area where that unit is likely to or can affect. It's often, these zones of control often form these kind of neutral zones that often develop during games. And it's if an enemy unit moves into that area, it faces the potential of being attacked by your unit. And a lot of what we're going to talk about later is kind of maximizing your zones of control and really trying to dominate the board with that area. You can see in our picture, the positioning of the Auroch in this situation is actually you're cutting out a decent chunk of its board control because there's a piece of impassable right there, and so it only controls the blue area. It doesn't control the red area. So zone of control is kind of the area your units have control over, and obviously your enemy's units will have their own zone of control, and often they can overlap. We'll talk about active chaff, which is what most people think about when you're chaffing, which is you put a unit in front of theirs and it prevents them from charging past. It's kind of physically standing in the way. But you also have passive chaff. So those are units that control or prevent enemies' movement in other ways. Those can be things like march blocking. They can sit behind or in the flank of units and prevent wheeling and reforming. There are a lot of kind of fun tricks you can do with chaff that prevents or affects your opponent's movement, and it isn't just dropping a unit in front of somebody else. Some terms I think a lot of people use. So backfield is the area behind the majority of your army. In general, you're trying to keep people out of your backfield and get into your opponents. Usually that's going to put you in a good position. And then front field, that's the area in front of your army, the area that usually you have a significant control over. So something we'll talk about later, what we term the main action line. So a lot of times when you look at the map or when you look at deployment, you can kind of see where the armies are likely to engage over, and often you can get a big advantage if you predict this and put the terrain in your advantage. So that's going to matter a lot when we're talking about deployment zones and terrain. A high value area, so this is an area of the board that has kind of a maximum effect. So it has a significant ability to affect both the center or the flanks, or just is dominating a really important position in the battlefield. We have what we termed a stall and a push flank. So if you think of a general army, a lot of times what will happen in a game is the armies tend to almost revolve around each other. And so a stall flank is a flank that you think you're going to be losing, and your goal is just to lose it as slowly as possible. Keep the enemy from coming up on you, but you know you're probably not. Your units are not going to win that combat, so you're trying to just delay or prevent the enemy from bringing its forces to bear on your other stuff. And then what we described, we termed a push flank, was a flank that you think you have an advantage as far as units and positioning, and you're going to try to be really aggressive and wipe out the enemy on that flank to then turn and give yourself an advantage on the center. And we often talk about the flanks because in most games, you'll notice that the center tends to be the area where the really powerful units sit, because that center position is really important to house your BSB, because the BSB in the middle gives you maximum area of coverage. Same with the general, so you're trying to get those bubbles over the widest area, and that usually is maximized by putting the general and the BSB right in the center. So then usually a strong unit is going to go there to protect it. And so often you end up in the situation where you have strong centers and the flanks are where the interesting stuff happens early game. Lateral movement is easy. It's just the ability to move side to side. So an infantry block is going to have very poor lateral movement. Whereas single models, so monsters, chariots, things like that, often have very good lateral movement because they can pivot, move their maximum move to one side or the other, and then pivot back to look in a good position. And then we have vertical movement. So that's forward, backward movement. So a unit like a Bretonnian Lance would have very good vertical movement, but very bad lateral movement. Whereas, a giant has very good lateral movement and vertical movement. It still has a move of 7. It's not going to be quite as far as some of the really fast units, but you get some movement advantages for them. So those are some terms we're going to use in future videos, and just some concepts to, again, try to start thinking about when you're watching games or playing games.
Okay. It does help when I'm talking to you guys. When I talk to you guys about how a game went, these terms will come up. You guys will say, well, what about this? And I'm like, so
yeah. And I'm sure, especially when you go back through a lot of your games, I'm sure you could probably, in a lot of these games, fit those terms into the game. And you say, all right, like I think, Gene, you just had a Saurian Ancients battle.
Right.
And there was clearly, one flank that was coming forward, which would have been your push flank, and you could look with that big house in the middle. You could see where the units were likely to engage. He had a big old fence right in his area. These sort of terms, again, it's stuff that everybody probably thinks about when they're playing the game, but it helps to kind of formalize them and start, adding some structure to these terms, so we can kind of really analyze this stuff.
Okay. Yeah, definitely agree. All right. So,
so the next thing we're going to kind of briefly talk about is a general strategy. So in general, and this is something that Hugo really emphasized. I think he had spent some time. Hugo was from Spain, and he had played with several of the Spanish ETC guys. And this is something he was kind of taught and brought to us last year as our coach. And it's a general way to look at the game. And in general, you are trying to control as much of the table as possible. Because you'll look at a lot of games and there will be a large area of the board that one team, oftentimes one army pushes out at the other one. And when you control these large areas of the board, a lot of times good things happen. So you're going to exert your control of the board. You're going to try to dominate the flanks. And ultimately what that'll do is it'll often push your enemies back into a disadvantageous position. And it will so it will put you in position for objectives. So in a lot of the objectives, dominating the center of the board makes a big difference. For spoils, often for secure, often for hold, the army that can move out into the center of the board and take control has an advantage on picking up those objectives. Same thing with Breakthrough and King of the Hill. You're needing to get out there, and if there's one army that's backing up or not able to advance, they're going to be at a disadvantageous position, which means that you're starting 3 points up on your opponent. Same thing when you push people back and they're forced back towards their own board edge. Their ability to move is much more limited. There's a table edge that's blocking them, and often the units start getting closer together. It's harder to wheel. Terrain starts making an effect, and we'll show some pictures later. But it's really hard to move when you're getting pushed back. It also congests your enemy battle line. Again, units start getting closer. There's not space to put everything. And a lot of times what that means is you pick up easier charges, or you can pick off units that aren't, fall out of the battle line. And then lastly, the more space you have, fleeing is an easy way to think about this concept. If you're in the center of the board and your opponent is on their board edge and they want to flee a unit, their units are going off the board when they flee. Your units have a lot of space behind them to rally and get back into the fight. So it's just one of those things that by taking a more advantageous position, by taking a lot of the space on the board and dominating that space, you're going to be in a better position overall in the game. So what this will tell you is a lot of times if you don't know what to do, you're in a position where you're like, well, this unit, I'm just not sure what to do. Usually it's a good thing. Grab a hold of board control, get it into your hands, and often it will play to your advantage. The other part of board control is a focus on the flanks. So again, usually people put the big hard-hitting units, the generals, all the juicy characters in the center. And a lot of times, you'll get these units that kind of stand off each other because, whoever gets the charge is going to have a big advantage in the combat. Well, the way that you break through that is you take the flanks. And that lets you kind of push everything together, or you destroy a flank, and that flank then can turn in and help you out in the center. We'll show some picture of that later. But, so the focus on the flanks is really important in this board control strategy. You pick up space, and it lets you kind of position better. It also, once you have control of the flanks, that unit can't face everywhere, and it starts letting you get rear charges, and it lets you kind of position units in better ways. So here's just an example. I just deployed an ogre army and an orc army that I had on UB, and we're just going to have two pictures. So this is the same units, exactly the same. And it's just, this is a picture of the orc army going first, and the next one will be a picture of the ogre army going first. That's the only difference. It's just imagining in the same battle who goes first and who goes second, and what that does to the overall game. So in this one, the orcs have gone first. They've moved forward. You see, we've already developed kind of a little bit of a neutral zone there in the middle. The orc player is starting to really kind of feel like the ogre player is forced back here. He's taking control. He's starting to form that arc, so his units start supporting them each other better. And now, you can kind of see that concept of if he has to flee or he needs to move back, he has a lot of space. But that ogre player, if he starts moving back or he has to flee, he's starting to run into that board edge. You can think about this if this was hold the center or secure. The orc army is already much better positioned to take tokens or grab things. And so just looking at this, so flip to the next picture. If you would, Gene. This is just the ogre, and so the Did I lose you, Gene?
Yeah,
oh, there we go.
Kind of disappeared for a minute.
So this is the same units, the same board, but the ogre player's gone first, so the orc player has to deploy anticipating that. So it already looks better, right? I mean, if you're the ogre player, this looks like a way better position than the last slide. And it's the same units, it's just one's in a different position on the board. But you feel better as an ogre player if you're in this position than if you go back to the other one.
Right.
You know, look at this position versus that position. It feels different, and there is a difference. It makes a difference. Taking that ground and starting to dominate the board position, you open up a lot of possibilities. The other thing is obviously, usually what will happen in a lot of these games is you form one army will form a concave and one army will form a convex arc, right? And so in this one, the army that starts surrounding the other one often has the advantage because its units become mutually supporting, because as they're forming that wider arc, a lot of their units will be looking in towards each other, so they can help support. Whereas the army that has to turn outwards, their units don't look at the front facing of each other, and it starts becoming a bigger deal. You know, you can isolate or you can multi-charge these things, and they don't have the counter set up that you would like. So again, this kind of board control strategy, what it's going to advocate is trying to get that position in your favor, and try to, you know, maximize a lot of, you know, basically good things happen when you take control of the board.
Definitely. And I can definitely see what you're talking about with the covering your frontages, supporting each other.
Yeah, like if you look at again, I didn't do the best thing on this. You know, I kind of just
Right.
dropped units to illustrate the point. But if you go back to like the ogre picture, or the ogres go first, the next picture. So like the Auroch can see any units that come into the tribesmen, whereas, you know, now in this position, those chariots aren't supporting the Edbasher block. You know, it's because they have to look outward to cover more threats. And then in this position, the orcs are going to start having issues because those giants can't, you know, the giant on the left can't really retreat anymore because now there's a war machine in his way who can't move. So he's kind of pinned into that corner. You know, the goblins can't move back. You just start getting congestion. Units can't move as freely. And then when you start pivoting, you know, it's going to be harder. So the only difference in these two games is one person went first and one person went second. And you can see what a big difference it makes just to the feel of the game.
And the person that went first did take advantage of going first.
Yeah, absolutely.
Could have sat there, right?
Yeah. And so again, in a lot of future videos, we're going to kind of advocate this strategy that when in doubt, if your enemy is giving you space on the board, take it, because in future turns, it's going to have an effect. And we're going to look for units and things that maximize that strategy. We want to control the combat. So what this means is we want to dictate what combats happen in the game, and we want them to happen on our terms. You know, I think a lot of games, people complain that they come down to dice because they say, oh, well, you know, unit A should beat unit B, but my opponent rolled really well on his dice and I lost. You know, I've been guilty of saying that too. I think at my ETC game against my Italian KOE opponent, I think I was complaining of that same thing on your channel. What you're trying to do is we're trying to put ourselves in, because if unit A beats unit B, but it beats it 55% of the time, then just based on statistics, there's a significant chance you're going to lose that combat. But if you can be your unit A plus your unit C versus their unit B, now you've swung the thing in a big way towards you, or you're putting, you know, a chariot into the flank to help you out. That switches a lot of the things. So this was something that was kind of generally a strategy that Napoleon used to advocate. So you want your A to fight their B, your B to fight their C, your C to fight their A. And what that's going to result as is you're going to have an A and a B unit left versus just their A unit, and now you can gang up on it. And we use this all the time in Warhammer. This is Ninth Age. This is why chaff is important. Your C, your worst unit, is taking their best unit out of the game for a turn. And it's the reason you do that is to get time for your other units to get an advantage on the battlefield. So a lot of times what we're going to do is, and we've kind of already mentioned this, you're going to have a push and a stall flank. A stall flank is, again, you're going to have a unit that is ideally should be worth less points than something your opponent put on the board. So in this case, the red unit is your opponent's unit. It's a very powerful unit, and your unit, the blue one, is not as good. And they're facing off at each other. So obviously, if this fights, their strong combat unit should beat yours. So your goal is to keep that from happening as long as possible. And it may still happen, but if you can distract that unit for a while and keep it out of the game and make it work a long time for your unit, then that means that you have an advantage on the rest of the battlefield that you hopefully can exploit and maximize. So in future videos, we'll talk about kind of stall flanks and what you can do with that. But the stall flank is you're just trying to keep your units alive and distracting their units as long as possible, so that you're maximizing stuff elsewhere. And then the push flank is just the opposite. You have a flank where you think you have an advantage in resources or an advantage in units, and you really need to exploit that and destroy the enemy as quickly as possible so those units can then turn to the center and help you out. So it's trying to put your units in a position where turns 4, 5, and 6, they are able to gang up on enemy units and really turn the advantage or the numbers into your favor. Okay. And then the last thing that we're gonna, the last way you win a game is you really need to focus on objectives. They make a huge difference in the game. So if we just look at getting a 13-7, there are a couple ways you can do that. You can win by 2,200 points and lose the objective, and you'll get a 13-7. You can also win the game by 900 points and just push the objective. Or you can lose the game by 225 points and win your objective. The difference between winning and losing the objective is essentially almost a 2,500 point swing in the difference there between you getting the +3 and your opponent getting the +3. So objectives really, really matter, and we need to focus on them both in list building, deployment, and movement because we want to win those objectives. They make a huge difference, and they can mean you can lose a game on points and still come away with a big win. So you need to plan for those objectives early. That's going to be in list writing, making sure you have enough scoring units, making sure those scoring units are mobile. Little things like, do they have musicians to grab spoils and then get away? Are they tough? Can they pass leadership checks? We'll focus on all that in future videos, but those objectives matter, and we want to be focusing on them even before turn 1. So just a couple of things to kind of put all these concepts together, just kind of show you guys what we're trying to talk about. And so this is a battlefield. I don't remember which map this was. I think this is one of the ETC maps. But we'll talk about which side is better. Is it better to drop for first or second? Is there a advantage to deploying in a certain place than the other? So obviously in this one, you can see there's a big impassable on the top side of the board. There are 2 impassable pieces. There's a building that's blocking up that deployment zone, and there's a impassable right in front of it, which are really going to hinder that defender, and it's going to make it hard for him to kind of advance out. He's going to be pushed into the right corner of that board, the upper right. That also means that the person on the bottom is going to have an advantage kind of moving up here. And we'll have some advantages in kind of splitting this up. So we have what we'll imagine are exactly the same units. Some defensive units which are marked with the shield, some aggressive units which are marked with the sword, and that big, scary center combat unit. So I think if you go to the next one, So the blue person goes first. He's going to move forward. You can see he's already thinking, okay, the left flank is going to be the upper left flank is going to be my stall flank with the shield. My defensive unit's there. It's going to distract that bottom player's biggest combat unit. On the right, he's pushing up real aggressively with his combat unit versus their defensive unit, and the two big blocks are kind of staring off. So he's taking board control. He's grabbing ground. He's feeling good about his position. I think you go one more. So turn, bottom of one, his opponent advances up, but he has to respect the other player's zones of control. He can't really back up as well with his defensive flank, and so he's in a little bit worse position. If you go to the next one. So in your turn, you've identified what your stall flank and your push flank. You think you have, you know how you're going to do this. Your stall flank is backing up. It's keeping that really scary or heavy flank of the opponents busy, so they can't turn and support the center. While your push flank is coming forward. It's gotten into combat. It's destroying the enemy's weaker flank. Now, at this point, your units you've won that flank, you've dominated the center, you're turned towards the center, and you now have 2 units looking at his 1, and your defensive unit is still alive. So one more, I think.
Yep, there it is.
Yeah, so now your defensive unit says, okay, I can't get away anymore, so I'm just going to keep you out of the combat, and you've ganged up on his big unit. So just starting with the same position, you're now in a situation where you can break his center, and what's about to happen is it's about to be his A or your A and your B versus his A or D. You're going to have 2 units versus his 1, and you've done it by dominating the board, taking board position, and winning on the flanks. Your flanks are doing what you designed them to do, and they're putting you in a position to succeed.
All right.
So again, this is real general stuff, and in future videos, we'll get into kind of more specifics and more, I think, more interesting things and situations and try to teach in a little more detail. But this is the general philosophy we want to focus on. And I think it's something that a lot of people can do to try to improve their game, is try to start thinking about it in these general terms, and trying to see if you can maximize these strategies in order to get better and win more often.
Yeah, that's it's really good. I hadn't, like I said, this is the first time I've really gone through these slides in depth.
Yeah.
I hate to admit.
But yeah, so go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was, like I said,
in future slides, I'll try to get more pictures in and try to get stuff that'll illustrate this a little bit better. So it's just not me talking with words on, or like words on the screen. But it's, again, just trying to present a general philosophy that we'll kind of flesh out in future videos on how to think about Ninth Age in a different way and try to improve your play.
All right. Well, this is, like I said, this is mainly just an introduction, and I'm going to have Ryan's definitely going to be back for more of these, and we'll get into more details and kind of take a little piece at a time, and hopefully do the 20-minute sections and little pieces that can help out your game.
Yep. Thanks, guys.
All right. Thank you very much.